Niagara Falls, New York, 1978. Lois Gibbs is standing in her kitchen on 101st Street. She is 26 years old. She moved here 6 years ago with her husband Harry and their son Michael. She thought she had found the best house in the country, good neighbors, churches nearby, a school 3 blocks away, kids everywhere. Michael was healthy when they moved in. He is not healthy now. Asthma, then pneumonia, then a urinary tract disorder, then a seizure disorder. Finally, a doctor tells her that Michael has a problem with his immune system. Her daughter Melissa, conceived in this house and born 3 years after Michael, has a rare blood disease. Lois does not drink soda. She does not allow it in the house. She cannot understand what is making her children sick. Then one morning in the spring of 1978, she picks up the Niagara Falls Gazette. There is an article about toxic waste sites in the region. The article describes 20,000 tons of chemical waste buried under the neighborhood surrounding the 99th Street Elementary School, the same school Michael attends. She puts the newspaper down. She thinks, how many times did we eat on that playground? She had brought lunches there. She had spread a blanket on the school playground. She had sat on the ground while Michael ate. The ground was the roof of a chemical burial site. William T. Love had come to Niagara Falls in the 1890s with an ambitious plan. He was going to build a model city. He would connect the upper and lower Niagara River with a canal, use the elevation drop to generate hydroelectric power, and attract industries that needed cheap electricity. He began digging. He dug a trench 600 feet wide and approximately a mile long before the financial panic of 1893 cut off his funding. He abandoned the project. The partially dug trench sat there for 3 decades, 60 feet wide at the bottom, 3,000 feet long, filling gradually with water. In the 1920s, the city of Niagara Falls acquired the property. It used the trench as a dump. The United States Army used it to dispose of waste from chemical weapons research during World War II. Then, from 1942 to 1952, a chemical company that manufactured plastics, agricultural chemicals, and industrial compounds used the trench as their primary waste disposal site. They deposited approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste: benzene, chlorobenzene, toluene, dioxin, lindane, chlordane, more than 200 different chemical compounds. When the trench reached capacity in 1952, the company covered it with a clay cap and brought the surface to ground level. They had filled the canal. They were done with it. The Niagara Falls School Board had a problem in 1953. The post-war baby boom was creating pressure for new school construction. The city was growing. Land was expensive. The chemical company offered to sell the canal land to the school board for $1. $1 for 16 acres of land in a growing city. The school board accepted. But the deed of sale contained language that the school board acknowledged. The deed stated that the land had been used for the burial of waste material and that the purchaser was made aware of this information. It further stated that no claim, suit, action, or demand of any nature should be asserted against the company arising from the use or condition of the land. It described the waste disposal as hazardous. The warning was in the document. It was signed. It was transferred. The school board built an elementary school directly over the center of the chemical burial site. Construction began in 1954. The 99th Street School opened in 1955. By the early 1960s, a neighborhood had grown up around it. Blue-collar families, chemical plant workers, starter homes, some government-subsidized housing. By 1978, 800 single-family homes and 240 apartments had been built on and around the former chemical burial site. None of the residents knew what was underneath them. The first visible signs of the problem appeared in 1976. The Niagara Gazette reported that some homes in the neighborhood were experiencing chemical seepage in their basements. Foul-smelling liquid was coming up through cracks in basement floors. Barrels that had been buried underground were corroding and pushing back toward the surface. The clay cap had failed. The state conducted preliminary testing. The results showed elevated levels of toxic chemicals in soil and air samples. The officials discussed the findings. They debated the level of risk. They debated the cost of addressing it. They moved slowly. In April of 1978, the New York State Department of Health Commissioner Robert Whalen declared Love Canal a public health emergency. He cited a significantly elevated risk of birth defects and miscarriages among residents. He recommended relocation for pregnant women and those with small children living on the 2 streets immediately adjacent to the canal. 2 streets. Not the whole neighborhood. Most of the 800 families were told to stay. Lois Gibbs had not been a public person before 1978. She was shy. She had never spoken at a public meeting. She would later say that she had been so shy she tried to hide behind a tree when neighbors first called on her to lead their effort. But after reading the newspaper article about the toxic waste, she went to the school board and asked that Michael be transferred to a different school. The superintendent refused. He said that if one child were transferred, others would demand the same and the school would have to close. Lois went home. She wrote a petition. She started going door to door. She had no experience organizing. She had no legal training. She had no scientific background. She had a sick child and a petition, and she knocked on every door she could reach. Within 48 hours, hundreds of families had signed. The Love Canal Homeowners Association was formed. It eventually represented more than 90% of the area residents. Lois became its president. She was the president of an organization that did not exist 2 weeks before. She was fighting a problem she had not heard of a month before. She had never spoken publicly in her life. She knocked on the next door anyway. The health data was becoming impossible to ignore. New York State conducted a health study of the families immediately surrounding the canal. The findings were severe. Women in the Love Canal neighborhood were experiencing miscarriages at rates 4 times higher than the state average. The rate of birth defects was significantly elevated. The rate of epilepsy, asthma, urinary tract infections, and liver disease in residents was higher than in comparable neighborhoods. The state tested basements. They found benzene. They found chlorobenzene. They found elevated concentrations of more than a dozen toxic compounds. A pediatrician in Niagara Falls described the situation to a congressional hearing. He said, "Where do you go from a medical standpoint? I treat the children symptomatically with medications to help them breathe better. We have looked for the cause, and we cannot find them in these people." He was right that he could not find the cause in the people. The cause was in the ground. On August 2nd, 1978, the State Health Commissioner declared a public health emergency and ordered the 99th Street School closed. On August 7th, 1978, President Jimmy Carter declared the first federal emergency in American history stemming from a human-made environmental disaster. This had never happened before. An environmental contamination event had never before been designated a federal emergency. The declaration meant federal resources could be directed to the problem. New York Governor Hugh Carey came to Niagara Falls. He met with residents at the 99th Street School, the same building that had been built over the chemical dump. He announced that the state would buy the homes of the residents who lived on the 2 streets immediately adjacent to the canal. He said the state would pay full market value for homes that were now worth nothing. The families who received that announcement had not believed anything could be done. They had been told to stay. They had been told the risk was being studied. They had watched their children get sick and been unable to find a cause. Lois Gibbs described the moment. She said when Carter declared his emergency, "We were like, yes, now the White House knows we exist. We have a problem and they are going to help us." But the help was not enough. Not yet. The initial evacuation covered only the families on the 2 streets immediately adjacent to the canal. It covered approximately 239 families. The 800 remaining families were told the risk did not extend to their properties. Lois Gibbs did not accept this conclusion. She began her own investigation. Working with Beverly Pigeon, a scientist at Roswell Park Cancer Institute, Gibbs mapped the health problems she was finding in the neighborhood against an old set of aerial photographs the state had uncovered. The photographs showed the neighborhood as it had appeared before any construction, and in those photographs, a series of old streams and drainage channels were visible. They had since been filled and built over, but their paths were still there, invisible under the houses. Gibbs began mapping health problems along those old drainage routes. The correlation was striking. The old streams had carried chemical contamination far beyond the 2 streets immediately adjacent to the canal. The contamination had followed the water. It had spread along the old drainage paths into the wider neighborhood. The clustering of health problems aligned with the old stream routes. Pigen presented the findings. The state disputed the methodology. The argument continued, but the evidence of widespread contamination was building. The congressional hearings that began in October of 1978 were driven by what had been found at Love Canal. The House Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations held 13 public hearings over the following months. 106 witnesses testified. Elliot Lynch, former chief chemist of the Niagara County Water District, testified that he had personally witnessed chemical company trucks dumping waste directly into the canal, uncontained, only 60 feet from the county water treatment plant. Lois Gibbs testified that the 99th Street School, which had 400 students, had been built directly over the canal. She brought the deed. She read from the deed that said the land had been used for chemical burial. The deed that was signed in 1953. The deed that had been followed by the construction of an elementary school on the site it described. The deed that was in the files of the school board when the school was built, and when the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rows of houses were built beyond it, and when the children grew up playing in the yards above the chemicals. The deed had the warning. The warning had been signed. The school had been built. In May of 1980, the Environmental Protection Agency released a study showing that a significant proportion of Love Canal residents had broken or damaged chromosomes. Chromosomal damage at this level is associated with increased risk of cancer, birth defects, and miscarriage across future generations. The EPA held a meeting to discuss the findings with residents. The meeting did not go well. 2 EPA officials were holding a question and answer session. The room was filled with residents who had spent 2 years being told to wait, to let the studies continue, to be patient. 2 residents decided the EPA officials should remain at Love Canal until the residents were evacuated. They were held for 5 hours. The White House was called. The White House called back. President Carter called Lois Gibbs. Within days, the federal government announced a buyout of all remaining Love Canal homes. More than 800 families were ultimately evacuated. The federal government paid for it. The political and legislative consequence of Love Canal was substantial. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, known as Superfund, was passed by Congress and signed by President Carter in December of 1980. The law created a federal program to identify, prioritize, and clean up hazardous waste sites across the United States. It established that the polluters could be held financially responsible for the cost of cleanup, even after the fact. It required the identification of thousands of contaminated sites that had not yet been dealt with. It provided the funding mechanism to address them. Love Canal was designated the first Superfund site. In the decade since, the Superfund program has addressed more than 400 contaminated sites across the United States. It has cleaned soil and groundwater and remediated damage that would otherwise have continued to spread. It has identified thousands more sites in need of attention. Before Love Canal, no comprehensive national framework existed for addressing this category of problem. After Love Canal, the framework existed. It was funded. It was law. The chemicals buried in the Love Canal trench have not been removed. They are still there. 21,000 tons of chemical waste deposited between 1942 and 1952, covered with a clay cap and surrounded by monitoring systems. The monitoring shows that the containment is holding. The neighborhood around the former canal site has been partially repopulated. Homes were renovated and sold. Some returned. Many did not. Lois Gibbs was opposed to the repopulation. She believed the chemicals had migrated too far through the old drainage systems to make any part of the original neighborhood safe. She received the Goldman Environmental Prize in 1990 for her work at Love Canal. She founded the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, which continues to advise communities dealing with toxic contamination. She has assisted hundreds of communities across the United States in organizing against environmental hazards, using the methods she developed going door to door in Niagara Falls. She started with a petition. She ended with a federal law. The deed that transferred the Love Canal land to the Niagara Falls School Board in 1953 is in the historical record. It is specific about what is buried there. It is specific about the hazardous nature of the waste. It is specific about the liability disclaimer. The school board signed it. The school board built the school. The city built the houses. The families moved in. Nobody told the families. The deed was a warning addressed to the institution, not to the people, and the people paid for 20 years before anyone officially acknowledged what was happening to them. The children who grew up in Love Canal in the 1960s and 70s, who played on the playground above the chemical burial site, who swam in the creek that ran through the contamination, are adults now. Some of them carry the chromosomal damage that the EPA study found in 1980. They did not choose to live there. They did not know what was underneath them. They did not sign anything. The deed that warned the institution is not the same as a warning to the people. The Superfund program exists because that distinction was made clear in Niagara Falls by a woman who went door to door with a petition and ended up in the Oval Office on the phone with the president. The 400 contaminated sites that Superfund has addressed since 1980 are the legacy of what was buried in Love Canal and what Lois Gibbs did about it. The chemicals are still there. The law that watches for the next Love Canal is also still there, built by a woman who was so shy she tried to hide behind a tree. The deed said, "Do not dig here." The institution dug anyway, and the people who lived above what was buried paid the price until one of them decided that was not acceptable. The law that followed says it will not be acceptable again. The history of Love Canal does not begin with Hooker Chemical. It begins with the trench. William T. Love walked away from his half-dug canal in 1893 and left behind a wound in the earth that would be filled with everything the 20th century produced and could not dispose of cleanly. First, municipal garbage. Then, military chemical weapons waste. Then, 2 decades of industrial chemical production byproduct. The trench accepted what was given to it. It was covered. It was sold. It was built over. It was inhabited. And then, slowly, over 20 years of seeping and migrating and corroding, it gave it all back. The families who bought homes in the Love Canal neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s were buying affordable housing in a working-class city. Lois Gibbs paid $135 a month for her home. She was a young wife with a husband who worked in a chemical plant. She thought she had found the best house in the country. The canal was 3 blocks away. She could not see it. She could not smell it. She could not feel it in the air. It was under the ground. It was in the soil that her son played in. It was in the water that seeped into the basement. It was in the air, in the crawl space. It was in the ground under the playground where she spread the blanket and brought the children their lunches. For 6 years, before she read the newspaper article. The congressional investigation that followed the Love Canal emergency produced a finding that was more frightening than Love Canal itself. Investigators found that Love Canal was not unique. It was not the first hazardous waste site. It was not the worst hazardous waste site. It was not even the oldest. It was simply the one that became visible. The investigation identified that there were tens of thousands of comparable sites across the United States. Old dumps, old industrial waste pits, old chemical disposal trenches, many of them built over with housing, schools, and commercial buildings, many of them unknown to the people living above them. The scale of the problem was not Love Canal. Love Canal was the edge of the problem that happened to break the surface at a moment when Lois Gibbs was reading the newspaper. The Superfund legislation that came from Love Canal was not designed to address one site. It was designed to address thousands. The inventory of Superfund sites grew as the program identified what was out there. The National Priorities List, which ranked sites by the urgency of their risk, eventually contained more than 1,000 sites. The total number of sites the EPA had investigated exceeded 40,000. Most Americans live within a certain distance of a former industrial waste site. Not all of those sites are dangerous. Not all of them have contamination migrating through the groundwater. Not all of them have clay caps that have failed. But the monitoring that exists today to evaluate whether they are dangerous, the testing protocols, the regulatory framework, the legal authority to require cleanup, the financial liability attached to polluters, all of it was built from Love Canal. Before 1980, none of that framework existed in coherent national form. After 1980, it did. The Superfund program is not without its critics. Cleanup is slow. The legal disputes over who bears financial liability can stretch for decades. Some sites remain on the national priorities list for years or decades without reaching full remediation. The funding has been politically contested, but the 400-plus sites that have been fully remediated represent real places, real communities where the groundwater no longer contains benzene, real neighborhoods where the soil no longer seeps into basements. The program cleaned up a former steel plant in Birmingham, Alabama, a pesticide production facility in Arizona, an old industrial district in New Jersey, a former wood treatment plant in Oregon. Each of them was a Love Canal that did not become the name for a disaster because the framework existed by the time the problem was identified. That framework came from Niagara Falls, from a half-dug canal abandoned in 1893, from 21,000 tons of chemical waste deposited between 1942 and 1952, from a deed signed in 1953 that warned the school board not to dig, from Lois Gibbs. Lois Gibbs describes going to Albany. It was August 2nd, 1978. She and a neighbor piled into her green Cutlass Supreme convertible. They drove 5 hours to the state capitol with petitions in hand. When they arrived, reporters surrounded them, asking if she was Lois Gibbs. She had not known she was famous. The state health officials were holding a press conference at the same moment. They were declaring a public health emergency and ordering the 99th Street School closed. She had gone to Albany to deliver petitions. She arrived at the moment the official declaration was being made. She said later that she understood in that moment that things were going to change. She had been going door to door for weeks. She had been dismissed by the school board. She had been told the risk was limited. She had been told to wait. She had gone anyway. The state made its declaration. The federal emergency followed. The congressional hearings began. The Superfund legislation passed. From the day she read the newspaper article to the day Carter signed the Superfund bill was approximately 2.5 years. She had gone from not knowing what Love Canal was to forcing an act of Congress in 2.5 years. She had started by knocking on a door. The 99th Street Elementary School was demolished. The homes on the streets immediately adjacent to the canal were demolished. The fenced-off area at the center of what had been the neighborhood is now managed as a monitored containment site. Monitoring wells surround the perimeter. Sensors track whether the chemicals are moving. The chemicals have not moved in the direction of the remaining occupied areas according to the current monitoring data, but the chemicals are still there. 21,000 tons under a clay cap, inside the fence, surrounded by wells. Lois Gibbs has said for decades that the 20,000 tons of chemicals will still be there in 200 years. She is probably right. The monitoring is the answer to a problem that cannot be solved. The chemicals cannot be removed without the risk of releasing them. They can only be contained and watched. The monitoring exists because the program exists. The program exists because the law exists. The law exists because Lois Gibbs went door to door. The fence around Love Canal is one of the things she built. What Love Canal changed was not just the law. It changed what communities believed was possible. Before Love Canal, a working-class neighborhood in an industrial city fighting chemical contamination had almost no precedent to draw on, no legal framework to invoke, no government agency with clear authority and funding to respond, no model for how residents could organize against a problem that required scientific expertise they did not have. After Love Canal, that precedent existed. The methods Lois Gibbs developed door to door in Niagara Falls, the petition, the health survey, the public meeting, the media strategy, the political pressure at every level of government have been used by communities across the United States in the decades since. Her organization, the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, has provided direct assistance to hundreds of those communities. Every community that has successfully forced the remediation of a contaminated site, every community that has used Superfund authority to hold a polluter accountable, every community that has organized itself around a health crisis caused by environmental contamination is drawing on the work done in Love Canal. That is the legacy that cannot be measured in dollars or in the number of tons of waste removed. It is the legacy of what is possible when someone who did not know what they were capable of decides that what is happening to the people around them is not acceptable. Lois Gibbs was shy. She tried to hide behind a tree. The deed said, "Do not dig here." The institution dug anyway, and the woman who would not stop knocking on doors built the law that protects the next neighborhood. The trench, William T. Love, abandoned in 1893, became the wound that would not heal until someone made the country look at it. The country looked. The law came from what it saw, and the fence around Love Canal stands today as evidence of what happens when the warning in the deed is not enough. The deed said, "Do not dig here." The law says we will watch this, and the next place, and the place after that. Forever, that is what she built.